I am absolutely thrilled to be here. Thank you so much for asking me. Um, I really hope that something of what I share today will be life-changing for someone else, the way that it has been for me. A little bit about me. I'm a maintainer of a large open source library of Python, Django projects and apps called Pinax. I'm also the DjangoCon US website co-chair and a DEFNA board member. We oversee DjangoCon US and Django outreach across North America. I first created this talk a few years ago, and the goal of the talk is that I want to teach you a process that will get you started collaborating and doing code review as quickly as possible. I have included a lot of screenshots in the talk because when I was learning how to do this, I really felt like I was in the dark about it, and I put a lot of knowledge in it. Some of it was kind of difficult for me to learn, but I have some good news, and that is that I've had the benefit of using this for a few years now, and I think I've been able to improve the talk with some of what I've learned. And one of the things I want to stress to you is that, well, it has to do with this tweet. There are people who are successful at using Git and GitHub who really don't know a ton of commands. Maybe they use the same commands over and over again, and they have the same basic process that they use over and over again. And while I'm not discouraging you from knowing a lot or improving, the way that I want you to think of it is that you're trying to learn a limited process that you can use indefinitely. It's a means to an end. And toward the end of the talk, I'm actually going to have kind of an exercise that I will suggest that you do that will incorporate some of these commands and that I hope will help you get started quickly. Some more good news is that I realized that Git and GitHub are extremely valuable skills to have. For one thing, not long after I originally did this talk, I actually got a job, and the job was based on knowing how to use Git and GitHub, and I was able to progress in my knowledge to the point of becoming a professional maintainer. I just a few months ago was able to oversee a major release, and that has opened up a lot of new opportunities for me. So I really strongly recommend that you spend the time to learn how to do this. And like Inessa said, Hacktoberfest is coming up, and it's an awesome time to start contributing. And if you do 4 pull requests, you can get a shirt and swag if you're part of the first 75,000 people. And there will be a lot of projects looking for contributors, and it's just an awesome time. So I want to tell you how I got started in open source, because I was my background was non-traditional. I signed up for GitHub back in April of 2013, and my account sat unused for a long time because I didn't know how to get started. I happened to be looking at Twitter, and I saw a tweet by a man named Dan Sinker, and he had made a really delicious taco meal. And he decided to create a GitHub project to have people share taco recipes. So I clicked on a link and I went to the project to take a look. And there was one question in the project that really did change my life for the better. And that question was, are you new to GitHub but want to contribute? And that was me. I felt like an outsider, and that was literally the encouragement I needed. I became really determined to contribute, and I submitted my first pull request to that project. And I wanted to build on it, so I kept using Git and GitHub, and frankly, I was not really that good at it at first. A lot of what I did was kind of in my own account, but I kept getting better at it, and something I learned about it was that as I continued to use it and got better, the mistakes I made went back into the history. So eventually I wanted to start collaborating with people, and I realized that a lot of conferences were looking for website contributors. So I became a DjangoCon US website contributor. And then I sort of started to feel like I really knew a lot about Git, and I wanted to be a maintainer. And I thought it was a valuable skill, and I was curious. So I asked if I could learn how to maintain the DjangoCon US website. And the conference leaders wholeheartedly said yes, and they offered me the role of website chair, which I accepted. And that's where I began to learn to be a maintainer, including how to review and merge pull requests. And that led me to write this talk, and it's why I use the DjangoCon US website as an example project in this talk. So if you were to go through this talk and do what I talk about in it, there are a few things that you need to have set up. You need to have a free GitHub account. You need to have Git installed on your computer and set your username and email. You will want to find your command line. It's also known as a terminal on your computer, and be able to navigate it a bit. And by the way, I have a slide later that has some commands that you can use to do that. You might want to have a text editor of your choice installed. I use VS Code, but there are lots of great ones. At the end of the talk, I'm going to have a slide that'll have a link to a repo, and all of my slides will be there, and I'll have a lot of links that can help you get started. I just want to let you know that even though I use the word code in the title, this talk is more about the process. And what I found when I was a maintainer was that because the site was in Jekyll, and the site was fairly simple, and it enabled me to not really be as nervous because I could just focus on learning the process and then move on to harder things. I also want to point out, I'm sorry that my screenshots are all Mac OS. I think that what I'm going to teach you, a lot of it has to do with a mental model. It's not really specific to operating system. I do want to point out that in the GitHub docs, if you go to the docs for setting up Git, for example, they do have tabs that you can click on to get information specific to your operating system. But I think a lot of this will be the same across operating systems. So I don't want to assume that people, I want this to be useful for people on all skill levels. So to begin with, I want to talk about what Git and GitHub are. GitHub is a website built on the version control software Git. I don't know if you've ever had a time when you've been working on a file and you've saved a lot of versions of the file with different names. You can use Git to save a history of the versions of a file or a group of files. Git originally was used just in the command line, and the people who built GitHub basically took Git and they integrated the functionality of it into a user-friendly website. It's kind of a social network in a way. You can make a user profile, you can follow people, follow their activity, you can find interesting projects. But the really important part about GitHub is that users can store and work on code together in something called repositories. For example, if I go to the DjangoCon US organization account, you'll see a list of repos, and one of them will be the DjangoCon US website repo. If you click on the name, it's a hyperlink that will open up the repo, and you can see the folders and files filled with the website code that actually powers the website, and you can look through it. But there's kind of a bit of a disconnect, and that is that there's GitHub, the site with this user-friendly interface, but you can't always do everything you need to do in GitHub, the website. You might want to make a copy of the DjangoCon US website code in your local development environment. When I say that, I mean on your computer where you install software and work on code. You might want to make a copy of it in that local development environment and install the software you need and run the code in your local browser so that you can add a feature or test a pull request branch. And this is where Git is useful because you have it installed in your local development environment and you use it in your command line. And you can use it to take a snapshot of your project at any time, and you can even revert back to a prior version. So I've got a screenshot of my local development environment, and in the background, I have GitHub open in the browser. And in front of that, I have my local folder window and my command line. And I can take the web address from a GitHub repo, and I can put it in the command line to create a copy of the repo in my local development environment. This is called cloning. And I can make a change and I can push the change back to GitHub, and other people meanwhile can do the same thing on their computers. And later on, I'm going to elaborate on that process in more detail. So I'm going to kind of go through a workflow. And firstly, I'm going to talk about collaboration approaches. We're going to learn about branches. I'm going to show you how you can work on a branch in a local development environment and push the branch to GitHub and submit a pull request. And then I'm going to show you how to some info about how to review two different types of pull requests as a maintainer. And then I'm going to give you what I hope will be some really practical information about how you can get started with Hacktoberfest. So I don't really like this term collaborative development model. It's used by GitHub. I think it's kind of fancy for what it means. There are two different models. There is the shared repository model and the fork and pull model. And they kind of tend to correspond to two different kinds of accounts, but not always. So there are organization accounts in GitHub, such as the DjangoCon organization that a group of people have access to. And then there are user accounts that an individual has access to, such as my own personal account. There is a thing called write permission that matters in this. And when we talk about write permission, we're not really talking about write in the context of English. When a user has write permission to a repo, it means that they can make changes directly inside of the repo. So for example, they can edit files. We'll talk about this later. They can push branches directly to the repo instead of through a fork, and they can merge and close pull requests. The reason why we need write permission is that what is in a repo can be really valuable. So for example, the DjangoCon US website is deployed live from a main branch, and it has a pretty high volume of traffic, and we can't just let anyone come along and make changes to it. So the repo owner gives a few trusted people write permission. So the way that we contribute to a repo depends on whether or not we have write permission to the repo. So if we go back to the idea of a shared repository is typically found in an organization account because you have a group of maintainers who all have write access to the repo, so they can maintain it. But by the way, I think that a user account repo can be a shared repo. I don't think it's as common. So an example of a shared repo is that the DjangoCon US website repo is shared. When I became a maintainer, I was given write permission to the repo. And along with the other maintainers who also have write permission, I can make changes directly inside of the website repo. So what happens if you don't have write permission, but you come across a repository and you want to make a contribution to it? What happens is that you use the fork and pull model. And this often happens in a user account. So the person who wants to contribute makes a copy of the repo in their own user account, and the copy is called a fork. And because the fork is in their own user account, they have write permission to it. For example, when I first came across the Django ConUS website repo, I wanted to contribute, but I wasn't a maintainer, so I didn't have write permission. So I forked the Django ConUS website repo into my user account, and I made a change to it. Then I submitted a pull request to the Django ConUS website repo. So to do that, you go to the repo that you want to contribute to, and you click the fork button. Or if you try to edit a file in that repo that you don't have write permission to, GitHub will automatically fork the repo to your user account because it will know that you probably want to make a contribution. There will be a message notifying you that it's being forked, and the forking message will lead you back to your user account. And in the list of repos in your account, you'll now see an entry for the fork, and it will say where it's from. And if you click on the hyperlink, it'll open the repo. The repo will have the URL will have your username in it. And it's going to be an exact copy of the original repo at the time that you forked it. And you can make any changes you want to it, including delete it, and the original repo will not be affected. And you also can use a fork. You can use it as a starting point for a project of your own, if depending on the license, if you want to use it for something else. So branches. So we've kind of figured out, the two different kinds of repos that you might contribute to. I want to tell you about branches because whatever repo you're working in, you're probably going to want to use a branch to contribute because they're a best practice and they're used really often. And I kind of want to tell you why, because I think it's easier to remember why if you understand. So when I first started using GitHub, well, actually still, sometimes I go into a repo in my own account, maybe that I have notes in, and I will click on the pencil icon to open it, and I'll make a change and save it. And this is okay, but imagine if you have multiple people all working on these files together. It wouldn't be very practical for them to all just be going in and making changes. For example, how would they give feedback? As the complexity of a project increases within the repo, we need to work differently. We need to make copies of the code base within the repo to work on the code. And these copies are called branches. And these are a few benefits of using branches. You can keep the main code base in the main branch stable. You can work on features outside of the main branch, and that may take some time. So you may have a branch with a feature in it that you're working on for a while. And it enables you to test and review code before you merge it into the main branch. So I'm going to just tell you a bit about this. When you create a fork, or when you create or fork a repo, the default branch is probably called master or main. By the way, GitHub has recently given the option so that you can select tick a box in your settings so that your main branch is actually now called main instead of master. And I highly recommend going in your settings and doing that. And in my talk, I changed it so that the master branch is now the main branch. So say, for instance, that you want to make a change in that branch, you can make a new branch and give it a different name. And now there are two branches in the same repo, the main branch and a feature branch. And you can create an unlimited number of branches and you can switch between them to work on them. And by the way, you can do this in the browser and you can do it locally. You can work on branches in your local development environment. When the feature branch author thinks it's done, a pull request can be submitted And the feature branch will become a pull request branch. And if the change is accepted, then the changes is merged into the main branch, and the main branch will be like before, except with the changes from the feature branch. So I want to go back to a screenshot of editing a file in GitHub. And there is a radial button at the bottom of the file, and you can choose that to indicate that you want to create a new branch, and you can give it a new name. And when you save the changes are not saved in the current file. Instead, a new branch will be created. And you can also create, like I said, you can create and work on branches through the command line in your local development environment, which I'll show you later. So I'm going to show you kind of a process. I want you to see this because, frankly, I didn't understand some aspects of this when I was learning to use Git. I'm going to show you the process of working on a branch in a local development environment and pushing it to GitHub and submitting a pull request. I've made a couple of diagrams that I hope can kind of help to communicate what we're trying to do. So the first one is for the fork and pull model. You're going to fork the repo that you want to make the contribution to. And then you're going to clone it into your local development environment using the URL like I showed you a while ago. And by the way, Git will track some details about the repo that you clone. And that repo, for example, if it's a repo you forked, it's going to assign it the name origin. And this is kind of known as a remote. And the reason why this matters is because sometimes you'll see commands where people have referred to the origin. And that's just kind of a shortcut that you can use that when you're, for example, pushing and pulling changes in between your fork and your local development environment. So you can make a change and push the change back to the fork, probably in a branch, and submit a pull request back to the Django ConUS website repo. This is what it looks like for a shared repository. You don't need the fork because you have write permission. So when you clone the shared repository using the shared repository URL, that is going to be the remote origin for you. So we make our change probably in a branch and push the change back to the shared repository and submit a pull request within that repository. And like I said earlier, when there are a few commands that you might need to know to be able to navigate through your terminal, mainly just to navigate into a folder so that your operating system knows that that's where you're working. The main one probably that you'd use is to change directory into the directory you've cloned, which is CD and then the directory name. So I'm going to show you a generic process. And by the way, I'm going to talk about this later. You don't have to, there are contributions you can make in the browser in GitHub. And that's totally fine. And I'm kind of trying to show you the whole process because knowing how to use Git in your local development environment enables you to do more things. So I just want to make clear that there are other ways of making a contribution. So I'm going to show you a generic process that you could use for either a shared repo or a fork. You're basically just cloning whatever repo you have write permission to. So we're going to go back to the screenshot of the local development environment. And I'm working in my home directory. I know that because I can see it from my command line. And the reason why this matters is because the repo is going to be cloned in the directory we are working in the command line. So you can type git clone and then the repo URL and hit enter. And there's going to be a folder that appears in your home directory, and it will have the same name as the GitHub repo. And it's going to basically be filled with the contents of the repo. And so now you basically have a copy of the code online in the GitHub repo, and you have a copy in your local development environment. And I'm going to change directory using that bash command, cd, and then the directory name. And so that I'm working in that folder. And if I, for example, click on the folder in the folder window so I can see the contents, I can see that I'm working from within the folder in my command line because the name of the folder is at the top of my command line and in front of my prompt. And we could pull up the GitHub repo and we could compare our local folder files with the GitHub repo files. And you can see they mostly correspond. Sometimes there's a bit of a difference because there may be some files in your local development environment that aren't needed in GitHub. And there's a file called .gitignore that can be used to prevent those from being pushed to the GitHub repo. So you can use git branch to see which branch you're on. You'll probably be initially checked out on the main branch as the default branch. And now we're going to make a new branch, and you can basically use the same command to similarly to create or switch to a branch. We're going to call the feature branch example branch, and we want to branch off of the branch we intend our changes to be merged into. This is really important. I didn't understand this at first, and it seemed kind of magical after I realized it. When you switch branches in your command line, the files actually switch to the files of that branch. Just like if you were in GitHub, the site, and you were toggling between the branches. It's not always obvious at first because when you first make the new branch, it's an exact copy. But if you go in and you make a change and you switch between them, then you can start to see the difference. If a branch already exists and you are just switching to it, you can leave out the -b. So at this point, you may want to open a file in a text editor, make whatever change you intend to make and save it. And then in order for the change to become permanent, we need to commit it to git version control. So we're going to do a git add dot and git commit -m and then put a note that's going to show up with our commit. By the way, this is part of Git learning. Some people do not like git add dot because they feel like it gives a little bit too much freedom. Just so you know, as you're learning Git, you may come up with a different way, a variation of doing something, but I've never had a problem with this command. And anyway, it's good to know. So now we're going to push the new branch named example branch to GitHub to our origin. And when you go to the repo, there's now going to be a new branch there, and there's going to be a message telling you it's there, and it's not really going to be affecting anything. It's just there. And if you click on the branch tab, you can switch between the branches and see the different branches. And, you know, like I said, you can toggle between the branches by clicking on the branches tab. And to submit the pull request, we're going to go to the repo that you want the change to be merged into. So in this case, we're going to go to the DjangoCon US website repo. The reason why I tell you that is because you can accidentally submit a pull request to yourself in your fork. And that might be something you might want to do later. I'm going to talk to you about using a repo to practice with. So you might actually want to do that, but not in this case. So when you go to the DjangoCon US website repo, there will be a message there probably telling you about the branch and suggesting that you submit a pull request, because GitHub will detect your fork and your branch. So you click on the compare and pull request button, and you're going to want to make sure your information is right. Make sure that the base branch is the branch you want your change to be merged into. Make sure compare branch is your branch, and create a title and a description. There's going to be a box ticked giving the maintainer the ability to edit the pull request, and double check your changes and click create pull request. I'm going to just tell you a bit about reviewing pull requests based on what I've learned. We're going to switch perspectives now and pretend that we're the maintainer who is reviewing that pull request. What happens is that the maintainer is going to get a notification about it, and there's going to be a link that takes them to the pull request in the browser, and they're going to look over the information, and there will be a files changed section where they can actually look and see what changes have been made. And there will be a link that says command line instructions, and there will be a merge button that can be clicked to merge in the browser. And so the scenarios that might happen, there might be a very simple change like a typo, and you might just see that and click merge. Or you might decide to ask the person who submitted the pull request to make a change. And so then you might kind of be done. But there are some situations where you might want to fetch that pull request branch into your local development environment so that you can run the code or run a test or work on the code before it's merged. When you click on the command line instructions link, it's going to show you a set of instructions about how to fetch the pull request into your local development environment. And by the way, the instructions are slightly different depending on if the pull request came from a fork or a shared repository. And it really doesn't matter. It's mainly because Git handles those two different types of repositories differently in your local development environment. But this is what matters. There is some overlap between the merge button and the instructions for reviewing the pull request locally. If you follow the entire instruction set, you're not only going to fetch the pull request into your local development environment, but you're going to manually merge the pull request in your local development environment and push it to the branch that the change is intended for. And basically, what I do is I literally just use only the instructions to fetch the branch into my local development environment. And then I do whatever it is I need to do to verify that it can be merged. And I go back to GitHub and I click the merge button. And I think, for one thing, people will sometimes protect a branch. And I did it at one time because I didn't realize, I don't know, I just was following the instructions. And then I realized that my colleague had protected a branch and I couldn't push to it. And it wasn't because of me in particular, but it made me start to think, if you merge the pull request in GitHub, you can actually revert it. It's only one step. If you try to merge it locally, it adds a step, and it kind of maybe is a bit more risky. So now I've got some Hacktoberfest recommendations, and I've actually, I think, used all of these. So this is the advice that I kind of wish that I had starting out. I know there's a lot here, and it's hard for me to kind of go back. I really can't go back very well to being a complete beginner, but what I wish I had done is I wish I had simply created like a sandbox repository in my own account. And I wish I had kind of known this kind of going back to that tweet about the handful of commands that are kind of the most, useful out of all of them. I wish that I had just gone through the process of literally just using that sandbox repo to become confident in, cloning and making a branch and pushing it to GitHub and submitting a pull request. I ended up later sort of doing this. But anyway, I guess the point is that going back to the idea of not needing to know much, if you're able to kind of grapple with this process yourself in a safe environment, even just using your own repo to, making a repo with something you've just, text you've just added to it, get your confidence up, and then go find a project you want to contribute to, and you can use the same process. There is a tutorial that GitHub has called Hello World, and I've put the link in the useful resources information. That tutorial basically does what I'm talking about. You make a repo, but all of it is done in the browser, which is totally fine. You make a branch, and I think you submit a pull request and you merge it. You should do whatever you feel comfortable with to get going. That's the most important thing of all. If you don't feel comfortable using the command line, I would really recommend that you think about it as something to get better at and in the future, because it expands your possibilities of what you can do. As you're looking at at issues on GitHub, you'll start to realize that there are some things that you can't do because you're not able to work with the code locally. And there's another thing I would mention is there is a tool called GitHub Desktop that I have not used, but I've had a friend who was kind of intimidated by the command line and use that instead. And if I'm understanding it correctly, it's an interface where you can use some of the commands you would use, the Git commands that you would use in your local development environment. You're able to use it through the interface. And she's been able to level up gradually. But if you feel comfortable doing it, this is just a very short little group of commands. Going back to what I demonstrated about working on a branch locally, you can do a lot literally just with these commands. This kind of assumes you cloned and changed into the directory, and you can check the branch with git branch. Hypothetically, if you were working with other people, for example, or if you've made a change to a repo, you could do git pull to pull in the changes from GitHub. By the way, I'm using git pull because I'm assuming I'm pulling from my origin. If you actually, sometimes you have to specify git pull origin branch name, by the way. You can create a new branch by doing git checkout -b and the branch name. You make your change, you add and commit the change, and then push the branch to GitHub. Hypothetically, at this point, you would submit a pull request, but I'm talking about, using a sandbox repo. But the idea is that you then go look at projects and find something you want to contribute to and fork it and clone that fork and do the same process. And I want to point out too that if you're a person interested in maintaining the pull request branch is still just a normal branch, and you can also, when you're working in a sandbox repo, you can actually go through the process of going through the command line instructions to fetch a pull request and merge it. One thing though is that if you've made the branch, in your local development environment and pushed it to GitHub, it's not going to work very well because the branch already exists, so you can't fetch it. But anyway, you could also push to that branch, and the changes will be added to the pull request up until the point that it's merged. And there's also a bit of interesting code. It's probably my favorite code. It's a bit of code to enable you to push to a forked repo pull request. And it was not obvious to me at first how to do this, and I did some research and found it, and it's really useful, and I have it in the useful resources section. So in terms of finding projects, you can look by tag. There will be a lot of projects that'll have Hacktoberfest tag or first timer. I will caution you that people's ideas of what is beginner might be different than yours. Don't be afraid if you come across an issue that you think is more difficult than what you're expecting. Especially help wanted. Help wanted can mean a lot of things. It can mean it can be up to maybe a senior level developer's issue that they're having problems with. They may be asking for help. So just don't be discouraged. Keep looking until you find something that speaks to you to contribute. A little tip I have, one year I was kind of trying to figure out how to get started with Hacktoberfest, and my local developer community did a promotion where they kind of aggregated information about local projects for nonprofits or government agencies or things that, or people's personal projects. And a lot of these were projects where somebody needed help making a thing, a nonprofit that didn't have much money, for example. And someone said, well, I'm not an expert, but I'll do it. And they didn't have much time or their skills were limited. And if you can find projects like this, there may be an opportunity to contribute things that that are needed. And it's also a great way to get more involved in your community. And there's often, well, you probably all know that there often is already a real sense of community that you can be welcomed into, versus going to GitHub and looking through the search, and you may not find that kind of community as easily. When you find a project you want to contribute to, firstly, there is an excellent contributing checklist in the useful resources. It's in a group of GitHub open source guides that are great, that I highly recommend checking out. There's a checklist you can kind of go through to evaluate if it's a kind of project that you want to contribute to. And then you might want to look for the contributing documentation, because often the maintainers will tell you some information about how they would like for you to contribute. If you find an issue you want to take, you may want to go in and comment to them that you'd like to take that issue. Sometimes people also think of a feature that they want to add, and it can be a good idea to go in and make an issue and suggest it first. Otherwise, if you just make it and you submit a pull request, if they don't want it, you may just end up having made something that isn't merged. And documentation, especially if you're a maintainer, it's a really great idea to have a README with great information about your project, what it is, installation guidance, a license. Code of conduct is very, very important to make sure that people know that it's a welcoming environment and contributing, like I said. And if you are a newcomer, your perspective is really valuable. And the reason for that is because you can make things better for the next person who comes along. A lot of times people who are have been around for a long time, they already have software installed on their computer, and it may be difficult for them to even remember what it was like to be a beginner. And you can add some documentation or you can come along and add things that can really help the project. So it's inevitable that you're probably going to have moments of frustration and get stuck. I hope I haven't made this sound like it's too easy, but there is a ton of documentation online, Google, Stack Overflow. The GitHub docs are very, I think, pretty user-friendly. There are also Git docs because Git itself is a software. The Git docs that I've looked at are kind of a bit dry, but they have a lot of technical information about Git. There are also some companies or organizations that have information not just about their products, but in general about Git, like Atlassian and GitLab have other tutorials and things that you might find helpful about your workflow or Git. And so that's basically the end of my presentation. Like I said, there are a ton of useful resources, and if you have any questions, feel free to contact me. And I really hope this will help some of you.